So, George, tell us about the attack that occurred this week, which has been branded this suicidal assault.
So we've been basically waiting for the North Koreans to enter the fray ever since we had this kind of confirmation that they were joining Putin's war in Ukraine. And when I was in Sumy, which is the sort of border town in Ukraine, just next to where they launched this offensive into Kursk region in Russia, while I was there, the North Koreans finally entered the battle. So there was a kind of question mark about whether they'd actually see actual combat or whether they would be held in reserve or what their role would be. And as it transpired, yes, they were used, and they were used in a pretty brutal kind of human wave assaults of the sort that we've kind of become accustomed to with Russian tactics in this war.
So how unsuccessful was this assault? I mean, what do we know about the numbers of North Koreans who potentially were killed in it?
So I think the Pentagon's assessment was in the hundreds. We don't have a precise figure yet. There's been plenty of kind of grisly photos that have kind of been shared online that shows the corpses of North Koreans in kind of snow-covered fields in Kursk. I spoke to one special forces officer. He described one particular attack. This was all along the Ukrainians' left flank in Kursk on the morning of the 15th. And just one of these many attacks, he said, featured roughly 24 North Koreans. He wasn't sure if they all died, but, put it this way, as he said, the attack was stopped because they just seem totally unaccustomed to modern warfare where you're constantly basically being watched by drones. There is constant surveillance. And in these kind of historical perhaps tactics or something, they were all clustered together. They were all kind of running at the Ukrainian lines, and the Ukrainians, I mean, they would have been bemused, but they've seen this before in, for example, Bakhmut. This Valery, who's the special forces officer I was speaking to, he was a veteran of Bakhmut, where, if you remember, the Wagner group had kind of recruited prisoners, who had committed the gravest crimes like murderers and rapists, and use them just to kind of grind down the Ukrainians and try and make the superiority in numbers tell eventually. And this is what he said appeared to be happening with the Koreans. So as much as it just looked like this kind of suicide, assault on the Ukrainian lines, there is a kind of grim logic to it as well.
So talking about grim logic, why do we think they were being deployed in this way?
Well, a lot of it is to do with the timing. Since Trump's election, Putin appears to have thrown everything at making as many gains as he possibly can before possible peace talks that Trump has promised to initiate when he comes into the White House. So in Kursk, which is the only kind of toehold of Russian territory that the Ukrainians have, even though it's a small amount of land, it has an outsized importance because it is Zelensky's bargaining chip in those potential peace talks. And regardless of the casualties, we're now seeing, regular casualty rates of 1,500 a day on the Russian side, which is just staggering. It doesn't matter because they are able to replace those soldiers they're losing, and they want to make all these gains as quickly as possible. Time is more important than the death toll for the Russians. So that's why you're seeing these Koreans kind of brought in to kind of contribute to this massive, human wave assaults to try and get the Ukrainians out of Kursk and deprive Zelensky of his bargaining chip in potential peace talks next year.
I mean, those numbers that you're talking about, those losses are obviously massive. What are we to make of the reports that there are perhaps 100,000 North Korean troops available to Putin to replace them with?
Yeah, so this is based on what the Ukrainians were telling me. They assessed that it would take 3 months actually to get those 100,000 troops to the front line and in a kind of position to actually join the fight. And bear in mind, I was speaking to one of the kind of top generals in Kiev, and he was saying that they are hoping to hold on to it for another month, perhaps longer. So it may be moot whether or not these Koreans actually are deployed, because what's happening is in Kursk is happening so quickly, and indeed similarly in Pokrovsk and Donbass and other areas of the front line.
What does Kim Jong Un get out of giving Putin, so many soldiers?
Well, by the reported terms of the deal, he gets Russian fighter jets. Basically, he gets
Right.
to modernise an aging fleet, and bear in mind his greatest fear is some sort of Western-inspired regime change. This just gives him something else to kind of deter any Western intervention in North Korea. So that's basically what he gets in exchange for potentially tens of thousands of North Koreans' lives.
And how did Ukraine and the allies of Ukraine react to seeing North Koreans on the battlefield?
Well, it was used as a justification for sanctioning the use of long-range missiles. So on the American side, it was the ATACMS. On the British side, it was the Storm Shadow. They said, if you are spreading the war to other countries involving North Korea, that basically makes it legitimate for us to use Western weapons to strike Russia. It's interesting that was the moment they chose because, for example, Russia has used Iranian drones for 2 years now, really. So the war has been widened. I guess the difference is that there are actual Koreans fighting as opposed to them just using Korean shells, which I think they have been doing for a while anyway.
Do we think that this is potentially these suicidal assaults are almost a sort of propaganda exercise by Putin to signal, we've got so many more troops than you, we can afford to just waste all these lives?
I guess it kind of creates a coalition for him. If Ukraine has assembled a pretty impressive network of allies, Putin needs to kind of respond in kind. He's got Iranian drones. By having North Koreans actually fighting, there's some sort of West versus the rest battle that he can kind of portray it as, but also sheer manpower. This is how Russia is making its advances. It just is it costs human lives, and it's willing to kind of take that cost. So every North Korean who they can send, to try and storm Ukrainian positions, probably, ending up dying in a field somewhere there, is a Russian life saved. So suits him down to a T.
George, you mentioned some of the scenes that people have been reporting, and it's probably going to be a bit of a grisly answer that I'm anticipating in answer to this question, so I should just warn people about that. But tell me about some of these images that were posted online and what they appeared to show in terms of a Russian soldier dealing with the corpse of a North Korean soldier.
Yeah, this was shared by Zelensky a few days after the North Koreans appeared to enter the war, and it's not entirely clear what the footage shows, but it suggests that a Russian soldier is trying to burn the face off the corpse of a North Korean, possibly to hide their ethnicity, basically to try and sort of provide some sort of plausible deniability that Koreans have been involved. It's impossible to say what his motives are, but certainly the corpse, the body does appear to kind of go up in flames. So, and you've also seen other footage from Ukrainian drones of the aftermath of these attacks and sort of bodies littered in these kind of icy fields in Kursk. It's all pretty horrible stuff. But bear in mind, this is what we're seeing in the West. It's not probably going to be shared in Russia, and it's certainly not going to be shared in North Korea.
No, absolutely not. You mentioned before that Ukraine, the Kursk region is really the only toehold that Ukraine's really got anymore in that area. How much have they, because they did obviously make some inroads with their surprise offensive in the summer, have they lost a lot of the Russian land then that they conquered over the summer?
Yeah, they have. They've been on the back foot for a while now, so they've lost 40% of what they had at one stage, according to Western officials. You could argue that's because they did better than they expected in the summer. They weren't planning on capturing quite so much as they got, but certainly the story of the last few weeks, if not months, has been of Ukrainian retreat. And indeed, there was one report that the Russians actually fought back over the border into Ukraine on that stretch of the front line. the Ukrainians kind of denied this, but it seemed a pretty plausible report. So there's no doubt they're on the back foot. And, I was speaking to, if you've got the Koreans entering the battle on one side, I was speaking to the Ukrainian recruits, those who have been mobilized recently, who are about to, go to meet them in battle. And they tended to be in their 40s and 50s. These are people who have not signed up so far. So for whatever reasons, they weren't kind of keen to join the action earlier in the war, and there's probably a reason for that. So they appear certainly less motivated than troops you might have spoken to earlier in the war. There is a weariness and exhaustion among those troops I picked up who are doing the fighting. And it's interesting, I would say, that the politics in Kiev is kind of still trying to play catch up with that, in the sense that even though Trump has been elected and he has said very boldly that he wants to do a deal and that will involve compromises, Ukrainians are kind of struggling to articulate that and debate that and work out what compromises they could accept. Whereas those who are doing the fighting, I must say, are starting to think, is this coming to an end at some point soon?
Yeah, absolutely. George, some of the Ukrainians you spoke to also made some interesting comparisons between North Korea and Russia in what they saw over the border in Russia in towns they had captured. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, part of what the Ukrainians were doing, as well as kind of getting a bargaining chip, was to just collect evidence, to collect material that you can kind of share online and expose what Putin's Russia is really like. And this was Vitaly, the special force officer. I suppose this was one of his jobs in Sudzha, which is one of the kind of really the main Russian town that they had taken in Kursk. And he seemed pretty disturbed by what he saw. He was kind of fascinated, but in a horrified way, in which he was sort of describing, for example, how in the schools there are all these textbooks that are talking about what a great leader Stalin was, and that people in their houses, they'd have lots of icons, and then they'd have amidst them pictures of Putin, and that they'd even have Putin on their bedside table next to pictures of their family and stuff, as a modern day Tsar, in essence. And then there were also kind of weirder things. There was a copy of a kind of a volume of black magic that was found in the kind of house of one FSB officer. That's the kind of Russian domestic security service. It's basically becoming a weird place, is what he was kind of comparing it to, for Ukrainians. And for Ukrainians, it's particularly weird because, people in those border regions can speak a kind of mixture of Ukrainian and Russian, and they are very similar, and they've just taken a totally divergent path after the fall of the Soviet Union, despite perhaps familial links across the two countries, where Ukraine has basically gone through. It's been successful at basically removing leaders, and even if one leader has been corrupt, and so it's managed to kind of churn through leaders at a pretty kind of at a pretty good pace, whereas Russia has been lumped with Putin for 24 years now, minus a 4-year hiatus when you had Medvedev. So that what you're seeing, as he described it, is kind of what happens when you have a totalitarian dictatorship over that point of time, and the kind of weird habits and that kind of make, even though people are unintelligible to one another and they share the same language, appears totally alien to the Ukrainians who are kind of going in there.
Yeah, a shared language, but a completely polarized culture now in quite a short space of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's also he talked about, for example, Vitaly is from a town in Donbass himself, and he spoke to one Russian woman who was an elderly woman. He said, she said, we watched the TV and they said that, in Donetsk, they voted to join Russia. So you must have voted to join Russia. He goes, no, I'm from Donetsk. I'm telling you, we don't want that. I don't want that. We're very happy as we are. And she's like, oh right, but no, honestly, the TV told us though. He goes, no, I'm telling you, I'm a person in front of you. So it's a kind of, that shows the kind of pervasive power of TV in particular, is this kind of brainwashing tool in Putin's Russia.